Welcome to Parables Part 8. We began with this study of parables and have gone through a number of parables to reach this point. And we're in Luke 15 now, looking at three parables that Luke recorded there, all of which were spoken at the same time, one after the other. In fact, as Luke 15 begins, we find Jesus in the midst of a crowd preparing to teach them. There are tax collectors and sinners who are gathered close around Jesus because they want to hear what he has to say. They want to be sure to be hearing what he has to say. But there are also Pharisees and scribes present in the crowd. Most likely they were there to check up on what Jesus is doing, to see that he was teaching orthodox things. And if not, they would, of course, have to deal with that. But these Pharisees and scribes grumbled about the tax collectors and sinners being there because they were considered to be unsuitable people for a good religious person to be associating with. So they grumbled that not only does Jesus allow the sinners and tax collectors to come near to him, but he actually eats with them. To appreciate what that signifies, you have to know that in the culture, the Hebrew culture of the time, that sitting down or actually reclining and eating with someone meant that you wholly approved of that person. It was a significant thing to do. So eating with someone was much more serious in regard to if they were not the right kind of people than just associating with them. Well, in this mixed group then, Jesus told three parables dealing with God's concern for the lost. And we've already looked at two of them, the lost sheep and the lost coin. Each parable flows very naturally into the next one. And they're just coupling words that connect them. So we definitely know that Jesus spoke these one after the other. And it's really like one big parable with three parts. In each of these parables, something was lost. The percentage of loss as Jesus moves from the first to the second to the third parable increases. And the lost sheep, there's one lost sheep out of 100. That's 1%. And the lost coin, there's one lost coin out of 10. That's a 10% loss. But now we come to the third parable, and it has a lot of names associated with it. It's probably most commonly known as the prodigal son. Other common names are the lost son, or the lost two sons, or the bereaved father, or the prodigal father. And Jesus begins not using any of these titles. What Jesus says is, a man has two sons. The younger leaves home under circumstances difficult for the father. They're embarrassing and not pleasant for the father. The father believes that that son is lost to him, and that would be a 50% loss. But at the end of the parable, we discover that the son who stayed at home is actually also lost to the father, but in a very different way, so that the father's actual loss of sons in close connection to him is 100%. So all the way from 1% to 100% loss. And the point is that God doesn't care about the percentage. If something is lost, he pursues it and works to bring it back into his fold. Well, let's read then Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32, which gives us the parable as Jesus spoke it. And Jesus said, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that's coming to me. And the father divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here in hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I'll say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound.' But the older son was angry and refused to go in to the feast. His father came out and entreated with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you, and I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him.' And he said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'" So here we have the story of a man who's apparently a relatively prosperous landowner who has two sons. He has an older and a younger son. They're not twins. In Hebrew culture, when the father died, the older son would inherit 2/3 of the father's estate, and the younger son would inherit 1/3. Well, the younger son knows that, and apparently he's not very happy at home. He's fretting about his situation. He yearns to be free to go to a place where his life would be filled with fun things to do. So thinking that he will eventually inherit 1/3 of his father's estate, he doesn't see any reason why he shouldn't have his portion immediately. Well, there was a reason. It was strictly countercultural. It was against everything that he knew, the younger son knew, and everything that the father believed. It was against everything the community believed. So in the culture that he was in, that is a very offensive idea. In fact, it's so offensive that the usual consequence would be for him to be disinherited and driven out of the house. So he, though, is convinced he can persuade his father. So he goes to him and he asks that he be given his 1/3 of the estate. Well, that is a request, as we've implied, is the same as saying he wishes his father would die. So his action is a great insult. If he obtains his portion, the community is going to consider the whole thing disgraceful and wonder why the father did this. The young man wants his portion in spendable form because he wants to take it with him when he goes to this wonderful place that he has in his mind. Because most of the father's wealth is actually in land, if the father grants the younger son's request, it will mean he has to sell land and other concrete assets to get the spendable forms the younger son wants. For some reason, and perhaps it's simple love for his son, perhaps for other reasons, the father agrees to this very unusual countercultural arrangement. So the father does what is necessary, and eventually he's able to divide the estate between his two sons, giving the younger son his portion in spendable form. The younger son soon departs for that place that he imagines to be heaven on earth. In that new place, he expects to live as a man of means in a place of pleasure. He quickly becomes prodigal. Prodigal means being a reckless spendthrift, spending without constraint until nothing is left. Now, the word prodigal can actually be applied to all kinds of things, and money is only one of the things that it can be applied to, as we'll see shortly. But this young man goes to a far country and squanders everything in an out-of-control lifestyle as he wines and dines new friends and enjoys the pleasures of life without constraints. But inevitably, his money runs out. A famine comes along. His new friends vanish. And in an attempt to sustain himself, he takes a job caring for pigs. Now, the point here is that pigs were forbidden to Jews as being unclean. So caring for them is about the lowest kind of job a Jew could imagine. Even with the small income the younger son earns, he is hungry. He has insufficient means to feed and shelter himself, and he gets to thinking about it. As he worked caring for the pigs, he suddenly comes to himself, and I assume what that means is he began to rationally consider what he had done and how through his own actions he was now destitute. He realized that his father's hired men were better off than he is. He thought, well, I'll return to my father, confess that I no longer have any rights as a son, and ask my father to make me one of his hired men, and I'll be much better off. So with that resolve, the younger son begins the long journey back home. But his father has never stopped longing for him to return, and we can imagine that every day he sits out and watches hopefully, hoping to see the son returning. And then one day, in the distance, the father sees what he believes to be his lost son, and he immediately jumps up and runs to see if it's really him, and it is. Well, this picture of the father running is something that is very foreign, again, to the culture in which he lives. The father is the Lord of the manor. He's the owner, or he was the owner, as we're going to see, but he is the Lord of the manor. And to think of him pulling up his skirts and running is something that no one could have imagined. So we see him doing something extraordinarily different than what is customary. So what does the son do? The son immediately begins to tell his father, I'm not worthy of being your son any longer. But what does the father do then? He welcomes the repentant, wayward son with open arms and heart. The father's welcome, in fact, was effuse, and literally it was reckless. The father was prodigal both in his love and in the physical gifts as he welcomed his lost son home. The father did not reckon or count the son's sin against him, nor did he demand repayment of the inheritance which the son had wasted before the father restored him as a member of the family. And that response offended the elder stay-at-home son. Now let's pick up a couple of things here. When the father says to the servant to go and get the best robe and put it on his returned younger son, who do you suppose that robe belonged to? To the father, of course. The best robe in the house would be his own personal robe. So in essence, the father is giving his best robe to the returned son. He gives him a ring, puts a ring on his finger, and he puts shoes on his feet. The elder son then is offended by all of this effusive giving to the son who left but has now returned. And sort of the last straw is that the father commanded that a lavish feast of celebration be prepared in honor of this younger son's return. These lavish actions convey a startling message. In the parable, the father represents God, and it is the father's grace to the returning delinquent son that is so prodigal in extent. So our prodigal God is prodigal with his grace and love bestowed on all the repentant returned sons who comes to him. These are pictures of God's grace. God is prodigal in grace. He's prodigal in mercy and forgiveness. And he can and does pardon and restore sinners from any and every kind of sin or wrongdoing. Is your sin murder? Is it rape? Is it stealing? Whatever it is, no sin is too great for dealing with by God when the sinner repents and comes to him. God's grace is more than a match for any sin of any repentant sinner. But now we come to the elder brother, and we're told that he was not very happy. And as he responds to the new information and reacts to his brother's return and the father's actions, we learn a lot about the elder's character and spiritual health. The elder brother hears from the servant that his brother has returned, that his brother has been lavished with gifts, that his brother has been reinstated and given a welcome feast by his father. The elder brother is furious. He refuses to go into the feast. And most likely that's the biggest thing and most public thing that the father has ever done. A feast like that they would invite the entire village. So there are a lot of people there. The elder brother will not go inside. He remains outside. The father feels he must speak to him. So the father must embarrassingly leave the feast. He's the giver of the feast, and now he has to leave the feast and go outside to talk to his older son, who is being a bad boy. So the bad son that has returned enjoys the feast provided by the father, but the good son who stayed with the father won't go into the feast at all. The elder brother actually has some things on his side. He has multiple concerns. First is that the father has spent a lot of money on the feast and presents to the delinquent brother. Where did that money come from? We're going to see. Something the father had never done for the elder was to give him presents or to give him a party for his friends. But undoubtedly, the major issue that concerns the elder son is the father's reinstatement of the younger brother. What that means is he brought him back into the family. And when he brought the younger son back into the family, that makes him once again an heir. He's an heir who one time had already received his 1/3 of the estate. So the estate is smaller by 1/3 than it used to be. And now this same son is a 1/3 heir to what remains. So the elder says, that's coming out of my hide, and I don't like it. The father responds to the elder son's complaints with tenderness. The father says, and he said to him, son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. Well, the father's restoration of the younger brother to the family was, in fact, at the elder brother's expense. It's a truth statement. The father earlier had divided his property between the younger and older brothers. That means everything in the estate belonged to one or another of the brothers. The father retained ownership of nothing. He retained use, but he didn't retain ownership. The father's statement that all that is mine is yours, when he spoke it to the elder brother, is literally true. It's exactly the way things stood. After the younger brother had taken his 1/3 and squandered it, everything that remains belonged to the elder brother. Restoration from a life of sin must always be paid for by someone. Restoration for your sin and restoration for my sins, for our life of sins, was paid by Christ. He paid it with his life. Does any of the explanations that we have heard justify the elder brother's open rebellion against his father? Will the family be finally reunited in love? Jesus doesn't complete the story. He stops and leaves it as is. Why does he do that? Well, we're going to look at that next. We're going to look at why Jesus stops the story where he did. Plus, we're going to look more at the characters in the parable and their relationship to the crowd who was listening. And there's some very important things that we will learn when we do that. So we will do that next time in lesson. Thank you.